Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas.
Hello and welcome. It's time again for another episode of the Being Human Utah Tech podcast. We're happy to be here, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Jim Hindigas, to introduce our special guest today.
Thanks, Randy. We've got Tamron Lee here, and when I listen back to some of our podcasts, I'm notorious for just launching in without actually introducing people, but then I also want people to introduce themselves so they can speak for themselves. And so, Tamron, what do you do here on campus, and what's your role, in the area that you're at, and also in the big picture of student affairs?
Okay, awesome. That's a great question. My role has kind of evolved and adapted over the last few years. I started out in testing as the director of testing. In 2019, I finished my doctorate degree in marketing, so I began to teach some marketing classes, and then just a year and a half ago, I started as the assistant dean of students. So in that role, I started out 2 days a week, and I was doing 3 days a week at the testing center, and then this year, I've shifted to 3 days a week at the dean of students office, and then 2 at the testing center.
That's great. And Simon, so you have a pretty active role on campus, and you're connected to a lot of areas. But the only time I really interacted with you on campus is through that testing center, and a lot of faculty utilize the testing center. So we've talked about in this podcast a lot about how technology has impacted our field. I mean, how has technology impacted the testing center and student affairs?
That's a great question, too. I've seen a general shift towards computer-based testing since I arrived here. And if I'm being honest, I would love to see all of our testing get away from paper and pencil and towards computer-based testing. It's more efficient, less human error, more secure. But just in general, it's shifted towards that computer-based testing. Another huge, maybe paradigm shift happened just before COVID. We saw the advent of remote testing. Mm-hmm. And I think that there was some AI influence in that, maybe not totally yet. I think AI is going to play a part in improving the quality of that remote testing. But you had companies like Proctorio, that's the one we're using here on campus, but there are others as well, Examity, many, many others. That's the one that we ended up using. Those can be great. They have a lot of advantages, but then there are also some disadvantages, and I think hopefully over time they'll improve. And I think as AI improves, those technologies will improve as well. Right now, there's ways to beat them. Just as an example, in one of my marketing classes during COVID, I put my tests on Proctorio for a short time. And I noticed that test scores went up by like 25, 30%. And the students loved it because their test scores were great, right? But then as soon as we were back in person and they started testing at the testing center again, then those percentages went back down to where they were before. So, I mean, just kind of anecdotally, I knew that they were cheating using those systems, but it's hard to know how. Anyway, there are lots of ways to cheat using those still, but I think they're improving, and I think that they'll continue to improve with AI.
Maybe a little bit of a follow-up here, and tell me if you can understand this. I think amongst many of us who are professors, we're maybe going in the opposite direction, that the advent of AI has encouraged many of us to go back to, at least in our classrooms, not necessarily in an online course, but in a classroom course, to do more of our own testing in the classroom, simply to see that our students are doing the kind of work. So, for example, I teach composition, and I really stress quoting and paraphrasing and summarizing. Well, when it comes to paraphrasing, AI, I mean, that's the perfect task for AI, right? You take a passage from a scholarly source, you put it in and you say, paraphrase this passage using college level diction and grammar and include proper APA citations. So I said, you know what? I've got to have students in class, no technology, doing that on pencil and paper. So can you at least see the impulse of some professors like myself to go backwards a little bit because of the advent of AI?
Absolutely. I saw that as well. We saw an initial decline in testing center use when COVID hit, right? A lot of, just by necessity, a lot of the testing went back into the classroom because it had to, or it went online to Proctorio. I think that's probably the more likely scenario back then. But since then, we saw a lot of them come back. A lot of them came back when ChatGTP kind of had their heyday and they were in the headlines a lot. A lot of professors would come back that way. But I'm with you there. I totally agree that there are some situations where it makes sense to change the way that we assess. And the testing center isn't necessarily the best fit for all of those situations.
Yeah. I mean, it's really forced a paradigm shift amongst us faculty that we have to think about, and I'm on board with a lot of the rhetoric, and it's not just here. I've gone to conferences and heard this, that let's not call the use of generative AI, cheating. Let's talk about it as, a tool that can be used in ways that, can be a shortcut to actual critical thinking and the kind of work we expect, but can also be very useful. So we have to have a paradigm shift of what our students do in our site and what they do out of our site, right? And, so for example, in my literature classes, I'm putting more emphasis on the kinds of things that they produce. Obviously shorter, not as in-depth assignments that respond to a literary text, whereas if I ask them to write a paper about a work of literature, a 10-page paper with sources that they work on obviously outside of class, then I have to be aware of here's what the student of 2024 is probably doing when I ask them to complete an assignment like that. And so it's forcing me to say, okay, I'm not, oh my gosh, these students are so terrible and they're cheating and they're taking shortcuts, but I just have to be aware of what I'm asking them for and how I'm asking them to demonstrate that they can do the kinds of things that I want them to do.
Now that makes sense.
I mean, I think you started out talking about how you're just kind of excited about what technologies that you're going to be interacting with in the future. And, a lot of times, especially on the faculty end, I think we feel a little worn out by having to feel like we're always having to adapt to the new, change. I mean, not all faculty members, but a lot of them, especially have been teaching for a while, just feel like I've got my rhythm, I'm doing my thing. Do you ever feel like these new technological changes are disruptive? Like you just figured out how to really test well, and then AI comes along.
No, absolutely. And when I'm teaching classes myself, I feel that, right? And no one wants to change what's working. And if you're doing like any kind of longitudinal study, it kind of throws a wrench into that too. So that's tough. Where I see this going and where it's most exciting to me is in the field of performance-based testing. Are either of you familiar with that, the concept?
The general concept, but why don't you explain it?
Okay. So performance-based testing is in large part simulations, and they're very effective. In fact, they're way more effective, way more predictive than a multiple choice test or true and false or any of the traditional ways that we use. But the downside is they're terribly expensive to create test items for, or to create a full simulation. It's just very expensive. And that's where I think AI and virtual reality can come into play and really help move that along and make that less expensive. And that's kind of what I'm excited about. I can foresee a time when we get rid of computer stations at a testing center and replace it with like a VR station where someone can demonstrate their ability to do something And that way it's really hard to cheat in that sort of a situation, right? But then you're actually showing that you can do something, not necessarily that you can regurgitate knowledge. Because right now, information is at our fingertips. You can ask your phone and it can kick out something. So having that skill of accessing, regurgitating information is no longer necessarily, in my opinion, as valuable as it once was. And I think what's going to be more valuable in the future is being able to demonstrate those abilities. And so I'm looking forward to the time when AI and virtual reality can kind of do that for us. And so I think, and that is a paradigm shift. That is maybe a lot of hard work on the faculty side to adjust. But I think it's worth it in the end.
And one of the things that we always kind of talk about, this is human nature. We don't always like to do work, but we know that it's good for us. And we working continually to get better as teachers is what we should be doing. It takes a lot of work.
For sure.
So sometimes it's nice to just be able to do the easiest thing, but which
now,
students will do that too. It's just it's human nature.
Yeah. Right.
Now both of you were teaching the English department, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, so you've seen your fair share of technological change as well. I remember when I was writing papers in high school, we started seeing these can't remember what they're called, like the systems that generate your citations for you, the citation generators, machines. What are your views on those? Are you teaching your students to utilize those, or would you rather they do them without?
It's amazing that you bring that up, because it came up in my class yesterday, and I was talking to a colleague about it this morning. Yeah, I remember a day when we spent a lot of time in terms of you've got to have your APA or your MLA handbook. You've got to, know the pattern. You've got to create them. And even when those first citation generators became available, I think I still kind of stuck to, well, I don't want you using those. I want you to be able to know how to do it. But now there's such a pervasiveness of them. And for example, one of our goals in our composition classes is to get our students very competent working inside the databases, the library databases. And every single one of those now has their own citation generator. And so I couldn't put my finger on when exactly it happened, but I came to a point where I said, yeah, have them start with the citation generator. And I don't know about the ones that you used when you were in high school or later on. The thing is, even to this day, they'll make tiny mistakes. And the biggest mistakes are usually in the capitalization of the title of the article. And a lot of times, some of the databases, particularly the EBSCO databases, will send it back with the author's names in all caps. And so it's kind of perfect for me to say, use your citation generator, let it build it. But in the back of our textbook, there's an APA style guide. You need to know it because you've got to check to make sure that the citation generator doesn't make a mistake. And of course, that eventually leads them to modeling it. And, the first couple times they do it, they have to look at the book 5 or 6 times, but then they get more and more familiar with it and it becomes second nature and they don't have to worry about it at all. So at some point I crossed over that line and said, it's a waste of my time to have them do it from scratch. There could be other things we could be talking about. Let's use this technology to our advantage. And I think it fits into that model of, ChatGPT, for example, can help us generate ideas, but there has to be a level of critical thinking and human interaction that goes in with it. And citation generators are just a small example of that. That's my experience.
I like that approach. I think it's smart so you're utilizing the technology, but then also asking the students not to trust it. And as I've used ChatGPT for different things, I've seen that it's not to the point yet where you can trust it. The latest software I used was RefWorks when I was doing my doctoral dissertation.
I remember RefWorks.
And RefWorks was just invaluable because it would catch like little changes, little things that were off between, in-text citations and the references at the end. And if I was missing one, that it would catch it. And anyway, just invaluable. But I felt like even though I knew the APA front and back, it allowed me to free up my time to work on the content a little bit more, right? I still had to go back and check it and make sure it was right because they'd ding you if you didn't. But yeah, I could focus on the content. I think I think AI is making research a lot easier too, right? Now you can go into ChatGPT and ask it to pull up articles that, have a certain theme, and that saves hours and hours of time, right? It feels like cheating to me because I had to do it the long way. I'm sure you did too. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. My take is, why not lean into it, use it?
Well, it's when I reflect upon a lot of my learning experience, and I think we want people to go through the same work that we did. Then that's what we thought was good teaching. You're like, all right, well, my professors made me do this, so you need to be able to do this. I don't want to say it's hazing, but hazing can sometimes be a part of it. But then when something comes along, you have to realize, well, do you really need to be doing it? What is rethinking what the purpose of doing it? In the past with citations, there was, when I started doing it, there were no generators, and so you had to go to the manual, and it was sort of unnerving because it seemed like every year there was some kind of new place that you put a comma or a parentheses.
Right, and to this day, the MLA style manual may be the most unreadable text that's ever been published. Right, it wasn't easy to find what you were looking for in the style guide.
So, I mean, when you have that one moment where you realize, oh, they don't need to go through the thing that I went through. They can learn because there's better technology around. I guess, when I think back to the fact, okay, so I'm not so ancient that I was around with the word processor, but I do recall a lot of the professors that I knew wrote their dissertations on typewriters. So I don't know if that actually does make me kind of sound old, but But I never felt guilty. I didn't need to write my dissertation on a typewriter and go back and do those little tabs where you could erase what that was a new technology that improved that and that process. And it was funny with the citation generators. I fought that battle for a while, and now I'm almost incentivizing using the article databases because they give you that citation. So many of my students want to just go rogue and choose some kind of sketchy Google article that I have no idea what the credibility of is. I'm like, well, if you use the article database, you get the citation for free. And so it's odd, that shift that went, at least from my own understanding of it. And that's a hard thing, that adjustment as you recall a previous technology and it's how you operate it, but now there's this new technology that you're skeptical of, but when you look into it, it might actually be a whole lot more useful. Just shifting gears a little bit. So a part of your job, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of dealing with the policing aspect of testing, this idea that you make sure that people aren't cheating, because there is this thought that they're going to get into this space. They don't necessarily want to take the test. They want to do well on the test. And so they're going to try to find the path of least resistance that will also get them the best grades. So, do you spend a lot of time doing that, or is that just a misinterpretation of part of your job? Or how do you view that type of making sure that people don't cheat?
No, I think ensuring exam integrity is maybe the biggest part of that job. We're facilitating like the logistics of the testing process. That's part of it. But I think the exam integrity is maybe the biggest part. Mm-hmm. And that's in large part stayed the same. We're doing the same types of things, but technology has created some both benefits and interesting new challenges. So we rely heavily on technology to keep the testing environment secure, right? We rely on our cameras. They've saved us so many times. Most of the time, our students will notice some odd behavior, and then we'll go back and check. The other technology we heavily use is lockdown browser. That's been a game changer. That's been awesome. So it allows us to keep students from using most methods of cheating. But then there's always the old school stuff, like they're using a phone or bringing in notes.
They still use little 3x5 cards like that are written in 5-point font. Is that still a thing?
They do. kids get creative. Some of this stuff's funny. Sometimes it's like writing on themselves. I mean, some of them get really creative, and like one that I thought was pretty innovative was they printed out a water bottle label. So it looked like the water bottle.
Oh.
But the notes were written in like the ingredients section, which I mean, it's a water, right? Yeah. There are no ingredients.
Let's hope not anyway.
Right. So, but I mean, so if you didn't look close at it, you'd never know, right? And they just have that water bottle there and they can see it. Anyway, one of the most recent, I guess, issues that technology has caused is becoming more and more widespread, and especially in the professional testing industry, is proxy testing. Are you familiar with that?
No. I have an idea of it, and it might be wrong. So you.
Okay.
Basically, you're testing for someone else.
Yeah.
Right. You're paying someone.
I was going to say my knowledge is The Sopranos, right? Somebody else takes Christopher Moltisanti's real estate exam for him.
Right. So, in the past, it's been limited to like someone physically coming and taking the test. So it's like a fake ID. Mm-hmm. If they're bringing a fake ID and you don't know what to look for, then they can pass off as someone else to take the test. But technology and remote testing, internet-based testing, has created this whole other issue where you can have someone take the test for you remotely. BYU, I was talking to some security guys at BYU. It's been a couple of years ago now. But they said they uncovered this cheating ring. They had a high-level engineering course that was really hard to pass. And so BYU had an online option. And so a lot of people were taking it and then transferring it to whatever school they were at, right? But they uncovered this ring where there's this group in San Diego who were tech guys who found a way to hack into the remote learning system that they were using. It's one of the popular ones, but I think all of them had the same vulnerability, so it really doesn't matter which one. But what they were able to do is just hack into it, and then they would take the test for you, somewhere in their office in San Diego, and then you would be at your house in your, whatever room you're testing in, and they would just take control of your system. So your camera is still showing you.
Wow.
But they're taking the test, right? And
that is crazy. So you're just kind of sitting there like this.
Yes, exactly.
Probably shopping on Amazon. And
probably, because they can't really see your screen.
Yeah.
They can see the screen of the person who's taking the test, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're taking the test, you may not even know what's happening because someone else is seeing the screen. Anyway, so this was a dilemma for them. They're like, how can we continue to offer this class if we can't ensure that it's secure? What they ended up doing, I thought, was pretty innovative, and a lot of these professional organizations have adopted this, but they had the student use their phone as a second webcam. So they require them to plug that in and set it up so it watched their hands. And then they would compare the movements on the screen with the mouse with the movements of their hands to make sure that they weren't cheating, and they busted a lot of people.
It's incredible
for doing it.
Is this why I have to log on to Canvas in 5 different ways?
No, that is exactly why. Yep.
I always I accidentally logged out of Canvas during class, and I was so mad because I'm like, I got to log in like 3 times to get back to this page.
I know. They call it dual authentication, but it's really like 3 or 4 times.
No, it feels, I'm sure I exaggerate, but it sure feels like a lot.
Right.
Now you touch on something, and you working with testing. I just want to get your take on this. I teach one class online a year. It's in the summer. Our students prefer. At least from my experience, our students in the summer don't want to be here. They don't want to be in the heat, going to and from class. So I teach an online class, and I've done different versions of the online training here. And, for me, it's something that I'm never completely satisfied with, but I only teach one online class a year, so I can live with it. Does it bother you, or do you have a different take on this idea that with all of this push in online learning, we've never, you just gave us a really elaborate example of proxy testing that I wasn't even aware of, but we've never really ensured, and I'm not sure we ever can, that the work being done in an online class is being done by the person who submits it, right? Maybe it's a spouse who does the work if the person's not a great writer. Maybe it's a roommate who helps them with one particular part. Maybe it paints me as an eternal pessimist, but in the bottom of the sort of back of my mind, I always have that. How do I know that it's the student who said they did this that did this? Do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. That's been part of our discussions in the last few years. Definitely on my mind. It's tough with these online technologies, and I absolutely think that some of that's happening. I know it is. We talk about that in our testing conferences. I think that issue is behind the requirement to have at least 1 to 2 proctored exams, events per class, right? And I think that's where the authentication happens. If it's not happening, it should be that the student is showing ID. If it's via Proctorio, I know part of their process is to check that ID. They have in-person proctors. They also have like an automated proctor system, which I think is what we're using right now. UT Online is really in charge of that, in charge of policing that. But to the best of my knowledge, that's how they're doing it. They're requiring them to show ID at that point. And so that's supposed to safeguard that. So if the student isn't doing the work and then they show their ID and you watch them in the video taking the exam, then you find out pretty quickly if they don't know the stuff, right? But those systems, although they are getting better, I know there's ways to beat them. I mean, just as simply as like putting a sticky note on the back of your computer screen. They have some algorithms that try to like track your keyboard strokes, or those are improving too, or some that track your eye movements.
Right.
And those are improving too. But I mean, like just a simple sticky note on the back of your screen can get around that, right? It's got your notes on it. You can see it. You move your laptop around. No one ever sees that sticky note. So there are still some ways to get around it. It's not a perfect system, but it does provide some advantages, right? It saves students a lot of money. They don't have to travel. It allows us to grow our online programs in a way that we really wouldn't be able to otherwise. Previous to this, before the advent of these remote proctoring systems, students that were taking exams for a class remotely, they would have to find a testing center, like a bricks and mortar center.
I've had students in the past have to do that.
And it's not terrible, but if your class, is structured so that there are, 5, 10, 15 plus exams, and some of these students in metropolitan areas are paying, some of them $50 per exam to take a test, like as a proctoring fee. We charge $15 at our center. For other schools, we're kind of on the lower end of that charging scale. But yeah, it would get expensive for students.
I always hear stories from my students of they'll go home on vacation, live in the most remote places, and they're like, I had to drive 2 hours to get to a testing center. I'm like, how? I mean, I was told that a lot of public libraries will do it. And so I'm like, how far away do you live? But, I'll believe them. One of the things that I'd heard from students, oddly enough, I think the most common complaint I've heard about testing centers, and in general, not just ours, is just environmental complaints. And part of me thinks maybe that's just the fact that they didn't want to take a test, and so they're going to complain about the couches or the. I've had students complain about lighting. Do you ever get environmental complaints of and especially in this idea that to prevent cheating, you have multiple cameras on you. There's a lot of sort of vigilance to make sure that you don't have, and so it's just naturally an uneasy environment because you're trying to prevent people from cheating. Do you ever get environmental complaints, or do you pay attention to the environment space to make sure that it is not something that they're going to complain about, or that the environment will help them take the test?
Great question. We do surveys every year to kind of find out where students are at, kind of gauge what's working, what's not. And we always get environmental complaints. Mm-hmm. But what I found is that they're kind of across the board, right? Some think it's too hot, some think it's too cold.
Temperature, right? I forgot. That's another one. They're like, oh, it's so warm in the testing. I'm like, well.
Right. Some think the lights are too bright, some think that they're too dim. So our strategy has been to keep it as sterile as possible, to keep it generic, sterile, as comfortable as we can, but knowing that we can't please everybody. But then we try to help whenever we can, right? If it's too cold, they'll wear a sweater. If it's too noisy, we've got earplugs for them, right? If it's, if they need extra stimuli to kind of get their brain moving, and they would normally like snap a pen or tap their foot, then we'll provide a stress ball, and then they can squeeze that.
That's
and
nice of you.
It kind of fills the same need, I guess, in a more quiet way, so they're not disturbing others. So that's a tough one. That's one we're always dealing with. We try to make kind of incremental, small changes where we can to the environment, but nothing too drastic, because then it's eventually someone's going to hate it.
Well, I mean, the real complaint is that they have to take a test and they're trying to blame other things. They're like, this pencil is the worst. So I could imagine that you're probably always going to lose that battle. I mean, they're always going to be complaining about it in some form.
Testing is stressful.
Yeah.
I think just the very nature of it. And I think that's kind of what we're battling.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that it'll ever be not stressful.
Yeah. I mean, I always tell people one of the reasons I went into English was that I'd much prefer to spend 5 hours at home at my desk and write a paper as opposed to sit in an environment and have to take a 30-minute test. Like it's stressful. It's like, oh, am I going to remember everything? Is everything going to go well? I'm like, no. I like the fact that I can just get up and take a drink break and everything's fine. There's no cameras on me. Everything's good.
Well, I don't know how much you know about this, but I feel like we need to. We're talking about physical environment. We need to take advantage of you being here because you're in the know. We, of course, occupy the 4th floor of the Holland building, but we, with the rest of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, will be moving into the new classroom building. And everything we have been told is that those classrooms on the 4th floor of Holland are going to become the testing center. What do you know about the future of the testing center, both location, physically, and things like that? And if it is, in fact, going to be the 4th floor of Holland, how do you feel about that space?
That's the last I heard. That the testing center's new location has been in flux kind of for a while. That's the latest I've heard. We would use those classrooms. My hope is to maybe take down a few walls. I know they're trying to do is make the remodel as minimal as possible.
Yeah.
But that saves us a lot of money in proctoring and in labor if we can take down a couple walls and make that one space. So that's the latest I've heard. And I think the plan is to keep us there for, 5-6 years until the new student center is built.
Right, of course.
And then at that point, we would either move to that new building, or probably more likely than that would be we'd move into the Gardner building.
Oh, okay.
In one of those spaces, either upstairs where the bookstore is or downstairs where the dining area is now.
Oh, I was not aware that would be a temporary arrangement on the 4th floor, but that makes sense with the new buildings that are coming online.
Right. I mean, like 5 or 6 years, I guess, would be relatively short term, right? But which is why they don't want to spend a lot of money on the remodel. But as I've learned over the years, sometimes it's longer, right? Mm-hmm. They've been threatening to tear down the building we're in for years, and we've ended up being there since, I guess it's 12 years now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. You've been in the old Harmons for quite a while.
Yeah.
My office is up there is in the meat department. I have a 3-inch drain under my couch, which I plugged when I got in there because it smelled bad. So I found it and I put a plug in it and then I carpeted over it. So yeah,
I did my BA and my MA up in Logan. I had a good college friend who lived in California. So I made a couple of trips from Logan to California, stopped in St. George, kind of got to know the amenities on the side of the road. I never went in there when it was a Harmons, but my friend from college, she remembers going to that as a Harmons. And I always thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a Harmons right across the street from us? We could go over there and get a salad for lunch every day. But we have really been pretty innovative in the way we've used the space that was once a supermarket, that's for sure.
No, I agree. I grew up in this area. I have some great memories of the old Harmons. The ice cream was right up front where Glenn Blakely's office was. I'm not sure who's in that office now, but every time I walk by there, I feel like ice cream.
That is always one of those funny realities, especially of a university like ours, where You're like, oh yeah, this building used to be that, and oh yeah, that was, and we'll purchase it and we'll renovate it, and then over the years we transfer to other spaces. That's quite a change that you would either go into the new building or one of the oldest buildings on campus in the Gardner. So that's going to be a tough little coin flip there. But
moving us is problematic because we get such traffic that there are fire code issues.
Yeah.
So most of the time they like to put us in a single story building or on the bottom floor of a. Well, but the Gardner, I think we could be okay either way because they've got great egress all around, for both of those spaces.
Wow, that's something I hadn't even thought about. That I could see being a problem on the 4th floor of Holland because, if one of those elevators goes down, I hadn't even thought about that. Interesting. See, it's always good to have people who come at issues from different perspectives than ourselves because I literally never thought about that.
Well, I think the Holland is well equipped though because you've got stairwells and you've got that big stairwell that that's above the
grand staircase right by the library.
Yeah, exactly.
That's true. That's true.
But I mean, you have students. The parking lot's pretty close to where you're at. There's no going up any floors where you're at right now, and so they would need to experience the same parking situations that we're doing right now, which is not terrible. If you've been to any, I always tell people, you've been to any university, like our parking is not bad, but it's still. I've going to the testing center. If you get lucky, you might get a parking space that's about 50 yards away from the entrance, and
sure,
it's probably not going to be the same
luxury
going into the Holland.
Honestly, that's the biggest perk of our current location is the parking, and the parking up there is amazing. But I think they're way more I think there's way more upside to the Holland than our current location. I think it would be nice for us to be on campus, and I think the plan is, I don't know if this is going to happen, but we'd like to be near the Booth Wellness Center and the Disability Resource Center. We're next to the Disability Resource Center now, but I think it would be a good fit to be right up there next to the Booth Wellness Center as well. One of the biggest complaints we get when we do our surveys is that there is a lack of study space. We've got like those tables out front, some couches in the lobby, but there's not a lot of good study space. And on the 4th floor of the Holland, there would be.
Yeah, that's and we've been in there for 12 years, and that is a massively utilized study space, both the private, the closed rooms as well as the open spaces. So I think that would be another great advantage for the testing center being there because students like to study there. They really do.
Yeah, I recall when we first moved in there, first few years, students weren't studying in it a ton, and I think there was some concern. They're like, "Are they studying here?" But now at this point, I rarely see a study room that's empty. It's always occupied, and that's most of the day. I'd say from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It is heavily utilized.
We joke on this program that we always get sucked into AI conversations. I have to say we've talked about AI less than I thought we would. So I'm going to play the bad.
We got to change the title now.
I'm going to play the bad guy and bring it back and, kind of talk to you in your kind of unique position where you work with the testing center, but you're also involved in the office of the Dean of Students. When you talk to students about AI, when you talk to students about how they're using AI, I feel as though with professors, it's hard sometimes to get kind of honest conversations going about it because they think that we think it's cheating. And so they're not going to be honest about how and how much they use AI. So in your position as the Associate Dean of Students, what are you hearing students saying about their use of generative AI?
I think most of my insight on this topic came when I was part of the provost's AI task force.
Right.
At that point, I did some research. I talked to some students. I talked to my own students too, and they were fairly forthright with me, I think. But they said they use it for summarizing. They use it to write papers. Bottom line, they're using it. So I think there's a great need for us to really be specific about our expectations in each class, because I'm sure they're going to be different for different classes, right? I think it needs to be spelled out pretty specifically what we'll allow and what we won't. Otherwise, they will use it. They're tech savvy. They know it's there. They know what the applications are. And if we don't tell them they can't, they'll use it.
Just anecdotally, I mean, the experience that I've had with a lot of the students, which is really kind of strange, is that a lot of the students, I thought it would be utilized heavily with students that were bad writers, that were definitely, that weren't very good students, that had bad study skill. But what I'm finding is a lot of the students, and they're pretty forthright about it, that are good students want their papers to be really good. And they will use it. And so I will find some papers and I'm like, well, obviously you didn't use AI because it's pretty rough. And you didn't, whatever you were using, if you used something, was not working to help your paper. And then I'll see this flawless paper from a decent writer, and they're using it to make sure that they get an A instead of an A minus. And so that's been kind of a tough struggle for me, because I'm like, well, I don't want to punish a student for getting, for turning in a fantastic work that they use the tools available to make it better. But I also worry if I'm not helping that student become a stronger writer, because they're using that tool. Like, they're always going to be an A minus writer because they're always leaning on that technology. Right. So that's been a struggle for me at times. Like, I don't know, we see that the students, the lower performing students that are using it to cheat, I'm seeing a lot of higher performing students that are just making sure that they are getting an excellent grade. And it's a hard thing to come down on.
I can see how that'd be tough. Are there any applications that you know of that you would want your students to use when writing a paper?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I'm just going back to an old technology. I was always an advocate for using spell check, because I was like, well, why would you? I get it. I mean, I'm a terrible speller, and it's embarrassing because I have a PhD in English. So, always fix the errors there. And I didn't ever see that as cheating. I didn't think they had to go back into the dictionary and make sure that they knew from memory what those were spelled. Right. But I don't know. I mean,
well, I mean. Yeah, I know our current department chair, Mike Peterson, was on that Provost's AI task force with you, and he utilizes ChatGPT and other similar forms of generative AI a lot. And I kind of do, but I feel as though I just kind of dip my toe into the water. I don't really do much. But when, for example, currently in my composition class, my students are writing a solve a problem paper. So I ask them to come up with a general topic they want to write about. But then, for years, I asked them, well, what are the main controversies and arguments that are going on in that topic, and expect them to generate ideas. To my way of thinking, ChatGPT is a great tool to use at that particular part of the process to do two things. If you say, I'm thinking about the topic of recycling, but I don't know what the current debates, I don't know what people are arguing about the most now. So I go in and I ask ChatGPT, what are the most powerful current debates in the field of recycling? At that stage of the writing process, ChatGPT does two things for them. It helps them to zero in on what they might want to focus their propose a solution paper on. And two, it gives them a whole bunch of keywords and phrases to then go and use in any kind of database search to find out sources for that. So I like this concept. But at the same time, I have to be very clear about there has to come a point where using ChatGPT stops and your critical thinking begins. Just quickly, I'm talking too much. I want to hear what you have to say about it. My eyes were opened a couple of years ago when ChatGPT was first on the scene. And the first assignment that I do in my composition course is literacy narrative, which is you talking about an experience you had learning to read or write. And I always stress, even if you don't remember exactly that conversation you had with your kindergarten teacher on your first day, create it and kind of remember it as best you can, but make it descriptive, make it help your paper. And so my students were brainstorming and drafting in class, And I looked, and one of my students was using ChatGPT, and all she typed in was create a conversation between a kindergarten student and her teacher on the first day of class when the student is a little bit scared about, starting school. And it just struck me that, I have to be very clear about that. It stunned me that someone would use ChatGPT for that, but then, I realized that that's something that they might do. So I have to be more clear in the instructions that I give.
Yeah, I mean, as long as I love that line of, okay, as long as it's not speaking for you and your own experience but it generates ideas. I mean, if it can get you to where you want to get faster in the research process, that I can't contend with that. But if it's overwriting your thinking, that's problematic. And that I don't know if that's going to be. I don't know if I'm going to get over that as a professor.
Do you use ChatGPT in your marketing classes? Do you have your students use any kind of generative AI?
I'm allowing them to use it, but I think I've structured the class in such a way that they can, and it doesn't really interfere with the assignments. So my assignments are mostly hands-on. In class, we'll cover a topic, and then we'll practice it. We'll do small group discussions or strategy sessions, whatever is a good fit. And then at the end of the day, at the end of the semester, they're creating a marketing plan for a specific product. And I don't require them to turn it in a fancy format. I actually prefer bullet points to prose. And so when I grade those, I'm just concerned about the strategy. And they need to make sure that all of the strategy points fit the product and fit the application. And I've tried on ChatGTP to see if I could replicate that, and I haven't been able to. ChatGTP isn't good at doing that right now. So I think that assignment is working for me in that way. But if they wanted to try to use ChatGTP or generative AI, tell them, awesome, go for it. And then if you can, let me know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just going to get better and better as it gets trained more, certainly. That's what we're finding.
And then if it does get to that point where they can, then maybe I need to adjust my pedagogy a little bit.
Yeah.
That's the way it's got to be.
That's what we're all thinking about
always
in the
about
classroom.
adaptation.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I want to thank our guest, Tamron Lee, who's in charge of the testing center, but also works in the Office of the Dean of Students. It's been a great conversation, and thanks to Jim for arranging this conversation. Always very exciting to talk to those around our campus community who are dealing with the same issues we're dealing with. So thank you so much. This has been Being Human Utah Tech. Thank you for joining us, and please be on the lookout for our next episode.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast. This has been a production from a podcast studio.